What's going on, guys? I'm your host, Jason Grubbs, and this is the Do Not Diminish podcast, the show where we tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. What if I told you that you might be helping the devil block your blessings and not even know it? Let's talk about all the ways we can allow Satan to get a foothold in our lives. This is episode 37. Let's dive on in. Welcome to episode 37 of the Do Not Diminish podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the various ways that we can be allowing the devil to get a foothold in our lives. Now, last week I talked about a strategy the devil uses to isolate us and to get us alone so that he can break us down and destroy us any way he wants to. Today, we're going to learn about a strategy that he uses, but he employs our help in. Now, I want to set this up first by going over the verse from 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. And it says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." Now, this is a verse that we'd be wise to pay attention to. It's telling us that we need to be sober, we need to be vigilant. Some translations will say be alert. Basically, we need to be on the lookout because the enemy is prowling about. He's looking for people that he can devour, looking for different ways he can attack and he can get inside. Now, we all know that if you're a child of God, that comes with God's protection from the enemy. And that means the enemy can't touch you because God's protecting you. Well, what if we are giving the enemy permission to attack us? And that is entirely possible. And that's something that can happen when we choose to allow the enemy in, even in ways we may not recognize are doing just that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And there's a few different aspects that I want to cover. Now, the first concept that I want to cover today is the concept of spiritual authority, meaning who do you give permission to run your life? Now, there's only one right answer here, and of course that is God. Now, if we submit to God and we're surrendered to him, that's perfect. That's the place that we should be. That's who we want running our lives. Any other answer, whether it's ourselves, whether it's we give into pleasure, whether it's we let other people run our lives, let the world, culture, Satan, any other answer is a bad answer and will only lead to destruction and will ultimately lead to Satan run your life anyway, because you'll fall prey to him and victim to him. So when we're talking about spiritual authority, you have to understand that we get to choose. God gave us a free will, so we get to choose who's in charge of our life. That can be God, or that can be a whole bunch of other things. And like I said, the only right answer is God. So when we allow these other things, then we can get ourselves into all kind of trouble because we're opening ourselves up to be attacked by the enemy. There's that classic saying in science that nature abhors a vacuum, meaning that if there's ever a vacuum, something is going to fill it. And that's the same thing that happens in our life. If we say, okay, God, you're not in control, I'm going to let something else be in control, guess what will eventually take that place? It's going to be Satan, it's going to be the enemy, it's going to be something that has demonic origin, even if it doesn't look like it or seem like it on the surface, because he's pretty tricky with these things, and sometimes we get so desensitized, we don't even realize that it's something bad. So this is what I want to talk about today is different ways that we can be allowing Satan to have a foothold in our life. And as we know, if you let him have just a foothold, he's eventually going to take over the whole thing before you know it. So there are a few different major categories I'm going to group this in. Number one is occult practices. So these would be things that are obviously things that the Bible talks about, very clear, plain English, like things like witchcraft and demonic worship and things like that. These are things that if you support these things, if you're taking part in these things, then very obviously you're opening up the door for Satan to have a foothold in your life. You're just welcoming him in with open arms. And but there's going to be a little bit of nuance there too, because sometimes we participate in those things without even knowing. But before we get into that, I want to cover the other two areas as well. Then the second one is addictions. Addictions is another way that Satan can get a foothold in our life because we've given ourselves over and we're slaves to something other than God. Things like alcoholism, pornography, drugs, anything that you can get addicted to. If we're addicted to anything other than the Holy Spirit, then that's opening us up for the enemy to be able to attack us and have his way with us and cause all other kinds of problems. And last but not least is any type of bad emotional stronghold. Those are ways that the enemy can slide in there as well. Things like bitterness, things like grudges, things like hatred. If you harbor those types of things in your heart, it opens up the door for Satan to get to you in all kinds of other ways. So let's dive in on these topics and figure out, and I want you guys to think about, as I'm going over these, I'll be covering them on a broad level, but think about if any of them affect you. And then after the episode, pray on it, ask God to show you any areas that he might want to highlight in your life that you may need to change or you may need to fix up a little bit. And once again, I like to reiterate this in all of my episodes because I don't want to just come off as if I'm preaching to everybody and I'm Mr. Perfect over here. I've had my struggles in these areas as well. And so that's how I know that we do need to address them, and that these are things that if we do address them, we're going to reap a whole bunch of blessings if we do, a whole bunch. Stuff that's beyond our wildest dreams and beyond our wildest imagination. So hang in there with me. This is probably going to be one of the toughest episodes that we've done so far on the channel because I feel like it's really going to be challenging. It's going to challenge us in a lot of areas that we don't like to think about, or maybe we just haven't thought about before. So the first one on this area of occult practices. So very clearly, if you're someone who's actively practicing witchcraft or actively doing seances, obviously that's nothing of God, right? And that's something that God said, do not do. It was something that the people who got kicked out of the land that God had given to Israel were doing. And part of the reason that they got punished because they wouldn't turn from that and worship the one and only true God. So that is very clearly something that we shouldn't do. Now, most Christians will already know that right off the bat, but you will see some Christians who are paying attention to the zodiac signs, or they're reading their horoscope and things like that. And that is also something that goes into that same category. And God talked about why not to do that as well when he was giving instructions to the Israelites. So those are things that people don't always associate with being demonic, but it is. It's part of that ancient Babylonian religion that goes back thousands of years. So zodiac signs, horoscopes, all that stuff, all bad. But I would say most Christians probably know that anyway, but some don't for sure, because I've seen some posts on Instagram and stuff that make you think. And now the other thing that I want to bring up though is sometimes our entertainment choices can fall into this category as well. And this is where people tend to find a gray area, or we tend to make excuses and not really call a spade a spade. But let's say you're somebody who likes to watch horror movies, right? And you're watching a horror movie and it's got a lot of occult practices in there, like people are doing seances in there, or it's a horror movie about demons and stuff like that. Now, you may not be actively doing it, you may not be actively worshiping those things, but you are participating in it when you're willingly watching it, especially when it comes to you're paying money to go see it at the movies or use your Netflix subscription or whatever kind of service you're paying for. You are supporting those things. You're literally giving money for somebody to make that type of content, and that stuff does not glorify God in any type of way. Now, I know to some people that is entertaining, and I'm not trying to cast judgment on that. Sometimes people like to be entertained by being scared, by being afraid. However, what you're ultimately going to have to decide is me getting a thrill out of this really worth costing me intimacy and some of my relationship with God? Because even though you may not feel like it is, it does, because this is something that's not glorifying God in any way. It's glorifying only Satan and dark things that are not of God, and it's propagating it into the future, because now you're paying money for these studios. There's an audience for this, so guess what they're going to make more of? That type of content, because they can make money off of it, and now you're spreading it on and on to further generations. So you don't want to be a part of that, and you also don't want to excuse it by just saying, oh, it's just entertainment, because here's one of the tests you can do. Would you sit there and watch that movie with Jesus sitting right next to you? And if the answer is not yes, then you know automatically, okay, this is not something I really should be watching. Because if you want that intimacy with Jesus, then you're not going to be doing anything that you wouldn't feel comfortable with him being involved in. So I know that's challenging. I know that's stretching for a lot of people. For some of you, a horror movie is no problem. You don't want to see it. You don't want anything to do with it. But for some of us, it is something that we enjoyed, or maybe something that we grew up watching before we got to know God better. And so it just kind of stuck with us. But we really got to think about these kind of things. And it's not just movies, it's music as well. There's plenty of really catchy beats and music out there with just horrific lyrics. If you actually sit down and listen to the lyrics or search them on Google and read them, the lyrics are just complete filth. Nothing that you would want your kids hearing, nothing that you would want anybody, your parents hearing, or like I said, you wouldn't want to be sitting there listening to it with Jesus. But because we grew up with that music, because we're used to it, because we're really emotionally tied to the beats and we like the way it sounds, they were unwilling to give those things up. And we can hold on to them all we want, but it is costing you some intimacy with God. And at the end of this episode, I'm going to issue you a challenge. Matter of fact, I'm going to do it right now, and I'll come back to it at the end as well, because it's really important. If you don't believe me, if you think I'm going overboard or you're just being legalistic, you don't have to abstain from all these things. These things they're not affecting me at all. Just try me out. Take a challenge, do for 1 week. Abstain for any type of negative music that has cursing or talks about drugs or is denigrating to anybody. Abstain from any kind of movies that fits the same criteria or is ultra violent and things like that. Just stay off of it for 1 week. And anytime you feel tempted to watch it or listen to it, substitute that with praying and reading the Bible and worshiping. And just see how much closer you feel to God at the end of that week. Only 7 days. That's not hard. You can do pretty much anything in only 7 days. Or you can do anything for 7 days, right? Even if it's really tough for you, you can last for a week. Just try it and see how much more you hear from God at the end of that week. I guarantee you your spiritual life will be way different. And it's not because you're earning something or you're checking off things on a checklist. No, it's because you're removing all the static. You're closing the door on the enemy so that he can't block you hearing from God. So I really want to challenge you guys with that. And the entertainment, especially for us Americans, for those that are watching that live in America, or I would say in Western society, entertainment is a huge thing for us. It's huge. We love our movies, we love our sports, we love our music, we love all kind of different hobbies and things like that. But are we making sure that what we're listening to and what we're watching is pure? Is it clean? I know for years, a lot of the Christian content was considered very corny. They didn't have the best actors and things like that. It wasn't high production quality. But if you look around now, there's actually a lot more now than there was in the past. So we're losing that excuse as well. But even then, that was never a great excuse because we're really just saying, okay, our entertainment is more important than our relationship with God. At the end of the day, that's what it's boiling down to. If we're choosing to watch things that are keeping us from getting closer to God instead of just sacrificing that and going closer to God without it. So we really got to make a decision here on some of these things. And that's why I want to challenge you guys, because God has been challenging me with it in my life. And I just want to pass it on because in the bit that I've listened to God and that I've honored him and said, you know what, God, I'm going to get rid of this thing. Even though I like it, I'm going to get rid of it because I know that it's preventing me from getting closer to you. God has honored that and blessed me 1,000-fold, way more than, to the point where now I recognize, I was really attached to this thing, but it's really junk. Like, it's not worth anything, especially when you compare it to a closer relationship with God. It's not even close. It's not even a comparison at all. But you got to start somewhere, and you got to start cutting some of this stuff off for you to really see. Until then, it's like you kind of have blinders on because you don't know what you don't know. We're so used to these things. It's been ingrained in our minds that we don't even realize how much is sticking in between us and God. We don't know. So that's why I'm challenging you to try it out. I want to read you a verse from 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21. And it says, "And Elijah came to all the people and said, 'How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him.' But the people answered him not a word." So Elijah's basically calling out the people here. The people of Israel, including the king and queen, they were all worshiping idols. And Elijah's telling them, hey, how long are you guys going to waver between these two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If you think Baal is God, then follow him. But stop wavering in the middle. Stop trying to play both sides because it doesn't work that way. And God is asking us that same thing today. Remember, we don't have to actively participate in these things. We just have to allow them to be a part of our life for us to be guilty of the same thing. I mean, you don't have to be doing sacrifices to idols, but if you're watching it all day and paying to watch it, then what difference does it make? And so that's why I wanted to read that passage, because I want you guys to see that we do have to make a choice when it comes to things. Now, the next category that I wanted to cover on this topic is on addictions, because they have the same effect. They allow the devil to have a stronghold in our lives and bring all kind of chaos and destroy what God wants to make orderful and beautiful. And that is because it's giving something else control of our will and control of our mind and our bodies. So addictions come in all forms. Like I mentioned earlier, there's alcoholism, there's pornography, there's drugs. Those are just the main ones, but you can be addicted to a lot of different things. It's something that you're allowing your brain actually does chemically get reshaped with addictions as well. And if you're someone who's fallen victim to addiction or given yourself over to it, then this is something that takes a lot of prayer, it takes a lot of intentionality, and it takes usually the help of others as well to help break you from that, to shape your brain back into where it needs to be. And thank God that God does provide that healing. So it's not impossible. It has happened over and over again, although it is very, very difficult. It's something that we need the power of God to do. But anything that we give control over our life, if it's not God, is a bad thing, because that means that thing is going to lead us away from God and towards it and towards destruction. So all of those types of addictions, I mean, those are pretty obvious, but there's a ton others as well. And I don't think I really have to spend a lot of time explaining how addictions are destructive, but having those addictions just gives the enemy another tool in the tool bag that he can use to destroy our lives. It wrecks our intimacy with God and prevents us from hearing from him like we should. And so anybody suffering from addiction, if you're watching this podcast, please get help as soon as possible. If you don't know where to go or you don't know where to turn, then you can comment, you can shoot me a message, you can do whatever you need to do, and I'll try to help my best to help point you in the right direction. But the number one thing when it comes to addictions is admitting that we do have a problem that we haven't been able to solve on our own, because we always try to tackle it on our own first, and we lie to ourselves and tell ourselves that it's not that bad, we can stop when we want to, and then when we don't stop, we make excuses and we make excuses and we make excuses instead of just stopping and addressing it and getting some help. So for anyone that's suffering from addiction, please, please, please get some help, and there is healing on the other end, and you will be restored and better off than before, but you got to start by getting some help. And the last category when it comes to this topic that I want to talk about is these emotional strongholds, things like unforgiveness, things like bitterness, holding grudges. Now, these things are things that we typically don't think about when it comes to the enemy using them, but he does use these as ways to get in, because these are things that are not of God. These are things that God wants us to be forgiving. He wants us to be merciful. He wants us to be compassionate, just as he is. Now, that's not saying that you're going to be a doormat, because God is also strong and he holds his ground as well. And he doesn't take any nonsense, but he is compassionate. He is loving. He's long suffering. He's patient, and he wants us to be the same way. So even though we get harmed by all kinds of people, by all kinds of life circumstances, it's not an excuse for us to be bitter. It's not an excuse for us to hold a grudge. It's not an excuse for us to not forgive. Because even if those things have happened to us and we were victims in those scenarios, we have also, if we're honest, we have also done things to other people that they could feel the same way about, or we have done things and sinned against God that if he chose, he could hold a grudge against us too. But he doesn't. He forgives, and he calls us to forgive so that we can be like him. So when we are unforgiving, when we do hold grudges, when we're bitter about things and we hold on to it, then that's a way for the devil to use, because it's something that we're disobeying God with. And if we're disobeying God with, then the devil can get on in there and he can make it worse and worse and worse. And he can turn that bitterness that you have into an anger problem, where you're really only mad at one person for one thing, but now you're mad at the whole world because you haven't been able to get rid of that bitterness. And that person hasn't apologized, or they haven't asked you for forgiveness, so you're not letting it go. And now you're upset at other people. We've all been there where, let's just take an innocent example. We've all been there where we're hangry, right? You're hungry and you're in a grouchy mood because you haven't eaten and you need to eat. And somebody just asks you a normal question. I'm guilty of this. I've done this to my mom. Sorry, mama, or Dr. Vaughn. Somebody just asks you a normal question and you kind of snap at them, right? And you say something that they didn't deserve. You say it in a mean way. And you weren't really mad at them, but you were upset because you hadn't eaten in this case. And so that kind of same thing can happen, but to a worse degree, when we're mad about a certain situation, or we haven't forgiven somebody for something, and so we're upset, and all of a sudden, now we're an angry person, and everywhere we go, we're biting at everybody, and we're snapping at everybody, and we're upset all the time, and putting other people in a bad mood. You don't think the enemy can use that to just start that like a wildfire and get a whole bunch of people in a bad mood to say hurtful things and do things that they regret later on? That's just one example, but it shows you how our emotions, if we don't get in control of them, if we don't submit them to the Father, they can definitely be used against us to not only hurt us, but hurt other people. There's so many scientific studies that show that people that hold on to unforgiveness and things like that, they get sick more often. And they get sick with serious things like cancer and other things like that, because it's rotting inside their body spiritually, and it will come out sometimes physically. So, and it's going to come out obviously emotionally as well. So we just never know how these things can be used, right? So you don't want any of that. We have enough problems on our own. Even if you act perfectly, there's enough problems that we're going to go through in this life. We don't want to add anything else to the mix, and we don't want to give the devil any excuse where we're giving him permission to be a part of our lives and jack things up more than they already are. So let's take some time. I want to challenge you today. Like I said, pray after this episode. Ask God if there's anything in your heart that you haven't fully submitted to him, or different areas of entertainment, or different areas of emotion, or any addictions that you have that you need to submit to him, things that you need to bring under his control and not your own. Ask him that. Sit there quietly for a few minutes and see what he says to you. Some of them I would bet that most people already know. These are things that, like, say you're sitting down and you turn on that TV show, you feel that little nudge in your spirit like, you shouldn't watch this. Don't watch this. There's too much cussing in this. Don't do that. No, don't look at this. And then we kind of push it away. At least this was me. Just ignore it. It goes away after a while. You know what I mean? So you pretty much already know. But if you don't, for sure pray on it and ask God to show it to you, and he will. Maybe the next time you turn on that TV, you'll then feel that and you'll know what I'm talking about. So ask God that. And then once you know what that is, take 7 days. Just take 7 days, 1 week, and abstain from that. And anytime that you normally would have been watching that show or listening to that song, or you would have been taking part in whatever addiction, or you would have been upset with somebody over something that happened 15, 20 years ago, take that time. I'm not trying to minimize anything either, because I know there's a lot of trauma that people have gone through. But take that time and surrender it to God by getting quiet by yourself, opening up your Bible, praying, talking to God, reading your word, maybe putting on some worship music, and do that for 7 days and see how much better, how much more clearly you can hear from the Lord, and see how much more your relationship with him is closer, and how you get blessings from that at the end of it. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. So as we close for today, I want to leave you guys with one more verse from the book of Joshua. This comes from Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 to 15. And it says, "Now therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord, and if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." So Joshua left the people with this challenge, because it's the same challenge that we face today. Choose who you will serve. Choose who you will serve, and don't mix them. Don't serve God on Sunday or whenever you go to church to serve, and then once you're out of church, now you're watching all this craziness on TV and listening to all this filthy music. Don't waver back and forth. Pick one and stick with it. And I promise you, if you choose God, you're going to have the best time, and you're just going to watch your relationship with him grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And all the awesome people that we read about, how God moved in their lives and they did all these miraculous things in the Bible, those same things will be available to you the closer you grow to God. All right, I hope you guys have a blessed week. Until the next time, peace.